Came across a really interesting story recently. There was a guy in Pennsylvania. He had gone to a flea market. In a flea market, he wanted to go and find something that other people did not value very much and purchase it for very little and bring it back and try to find more value in it than the person who was giving it away. And so he goes to the flea market and he's searching around, and the guy really doesn't find very many useful things, but he did come across this one painting that he found. And he thought back to his house, and he had a spot on his wall that was kind of empty that he could put this painting up. It wasn't, a Rembrandt by any stretch of the imagination, but it was something nice he could look at as he walked down the hallway. And so he paid $4, got this painting, and he's thinking as he's going home, well, the painting honestly really isn't that great, but maybe I can restore the frame. Sand it down a little bit, put some new finish on it or something. And so he takes it home and he starts to try to restore the frame. And part of the problem may be he didn't take the painting out before he tried to restore the frame, but he's doing the thing. He's sanding it. He tries. I didn't quite get everything out that he wants to get out. He tries then to stain it. Doesn't quite do it. He tries maybe just painting it, but it still doesn't look like what he thought it might look like. Well, he thought, at this point, maybe I can just at least keep the painting and pop it in another frame. I still have that empty spot on my wall. I can just throw it in there. And so he pulls the painting out, and then he notices something. There's a folded up piece of paper behind the painting. It looks really, really old. And so he gets the piece of paper and he unfolds it, and it's a document, a famous document. He's like, this is pretty old, and it's probably some copy, maybe 100 years old or so. It's pretty neat. I can show my friends and do this. And one day he had a friend over, and he showed him this really old document. He said, isn't this pretty cool? This thing, it's really old. And the friend said, man, that looks older than what you think it is. You should probably get somebody to look at that document, that piece of paper. And so he calls some people, and people look at it, and they call some other people, and finally he gets people from Sotheby's, the famous auction house in New York, come and look at it. And he ends up putting this old document for sale because it is now one of the original, still surviving 24 copies of the Declaration of Independence that was folded, stuffed behind this painting, and been sitting there for over 200 years. And it was folded in such a hurry, the ink was still wet, so you could still see the impressions on the reverse side from where it was folded. And there were fewer than 10 of those 24 copies that are not mounted on something, so it makes it even more valuable. He paid $4 for this thing at a flea market and sold at auction for $2.4 million. Something that was devalued. The guy giving it away did not have any value in this thing. The guy receiving it had no value in this thing. But what neither one of them realized is the hidden value that was within. And that is exactly what we're talking about today in Romans chapter 13. We're talking about value in something that is often devalued, a lot of times in our use of it. Particularly today in Romans 13, love. Love. We often don't value love all that much because of our use in our language of the word, particularly. And here in Romans chapter 13, Paul, who wrote the book of Romans, this letter that he wrote to a bunch of Christians living in Rome, he gets to this point and he's been talking about love. He mentions love in Romans chapter 12. He talks about worship and how we can worship God as in how we have relationship with each other. We can worship God and how we love each other, that if we truly worship God, we will demonstrate that worship and that love through how we love each other. And then he starts this section at the beginning of Romans 13, having just talked about worship, having just talked about relationship, having just talked about love. He kind of takes a sidetrack here for a minute. He's going to start talking about love again, but he gets this little weird section at the beginning of Romans 13, and he stops talking about love. He talks about it, doesn't talk about it, and then talks about it again. And you would kind of think, maybe Paul loses his train of thought, as we all do sometimes, right? We start talking about one thing, and then we start chasing rabbits, and we ended up way out in left field, don't even realize how we got there kind of situation. Anybody like that? Anybody know anybody sitting by somebody like that? Right? Well, Paul, right, he's been talking about love. He's going to talk about love again. and then he takes a few verses and he talks about the government. That kind of weird to you? If he's talking about love with somebody, in-depth, theological conversation about love, I don't know about you, but the government doesn't pop in my mind, right? Well, that's where Paul goes here. Romans chapter 13, starting in verse 1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Now, think about that for a second. He talks about the governing authority. He's talking about the government. God allows everyone who is in authority to be there. He allows it to be there. And now we can think about that in terms of American politics, but think about that in their context in terms of Roman politics that were hostile towards this particular kind of religion. That government is going to end up killing Paul. And he's writing still, submit to them, because God allowed them to be there. Verse 2. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Now, hold up, Paul. You're getting a little. We're American, right? We that's our history. We rise up and we revolt. American Revolution, George Washington. We're all over that. Take down the redcoats. But he's writing here in a very unique way, and he's going to get to his point in just a second. Verse 3. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear over one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive the approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. Now, he's not saying first, right off the bat, that no matter what the government does, you should obey them, always, without exception. Because we actually see in the book of Acts something contrary to that line of thinking. In Acts chapter 4, verse 19, Peter and the apostles, they say, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than God, talking to some government officials, you must judge. And then again, in Acts chapter 5, they say again, we must obey God rather than men. See, when it comes down to the governing authority saying you must reject Jesus, stop telling people about Jesus, or you're going to be punished, that's the line in the sand. Well, no, we're not going to stop talking about Jesus. We're not going to stop talking about what God's told us to talk about. We're going to go the way God wants us to go. But Paul says, up until that point, we need to submit, not for the sake of the government. Again, remember, he's been talking about love. He's about to talk about love. And I'm thinking in my mind, reading this, maybe you're reading this for the first time. Paul, where in the world are you going with this line of thinking? He says, we must obey God rather than men, but up until that point, we must live in subjection. Verse 5 is what he says. But look at verse 6. This is where he begins to turn it. For because of this, you also must pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God attending to this very thing. So, wait a minute, right? He's been talking about love. He starts talking about submitting to the government, and now he's talking about paying your taxes. And you're thinking, I don't like Paul very much at this second, right? I'm thinking about love. I'm not thinking about the government. I'm definitely not thinking about paying taxes. But he's going there. An interesting point of fact, this is a complete side note, chasing rabbits, right? A complete aside. You know, there's a lot of preachers today and a lot of religious leaders today who say we need to talk about this issue and that issue and this political thing and that political thing. You know, the only political thing that Jesus ever made, the only political comment Jesus ever made, you know what it was? Pay your taxes. Say, what? Right? That's the only thing he ever said. And he lived in a time that was a lot harsher than our time today, even as harsh as it is today. He lived in that time, and Jesus' only political comment he ever made that we have recorded in Scripture was pay your taxes. And now Paul is doing the same thing. Pay your taxes. Pay your taxes. Paul, what are you talking about? I mean, the book of Romans is supposed to be the setup for how the Christian life is supposed to be lived. He's supposed to explain to us in the book of Romans everything we're supposed to believe, the foundations of what we're supposed to believe in Christianity, and then the practical steps of what we're supposed to live. And then he takes this little thing here and he starts talking about the government and taxes, and I'm thinking, Paul, you have lost it, all right? I don't want to know about politics. I don't want to know about the government. I don't want to know about taxes. Tell me about Jesus. Look at verse 7. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed. Revenue to whom revenue is owed. Respect to whom respect is owed. Honor to whom honor is owed. Now, you begin to see what he's doing. He talked about the government for 5 verses. Talked about taxes in verse 6. And now in verse 7, he's turning the ship. Turning the ship, and he's about to talk about love again. He's been setting it up, getting it ready for what's about to come. He talked about worship in chapter 12. He talked about loving people around us, even our enemies, loving people. And now he's talking about government because he's setting up what's about to happen. He's setting up what he's about to talk about. He's setting up his very next argument. You see, Paul, he's not really taking a detour from what he's talking about, how to practically live out our faith, by talking about the government and taxes. He's transitioning into what's coming. He's setting up, he's teeing up what's coming. It's a setup for what's about to come. A lot of times I don't know how you feel in your life, but do you ever feel like you're going through a situation and it feels like a detour from where you're supposed to be? Like it feels like a distraction from what you're supposed to be. Maybe it's an emotion you're going through. Maybe it's a medical thing you're going through. Maybe it's something at work. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe, it's just this feeling you've got in life. And it feels like, you're distracted or you've taken a detour from where you really need to be, where you really need to be focused on. You're just thinking, well, if I can just get to the next season of my life, then it will be great. Everything will be fantastic. Well, quite possibly, maybe we need to shift our perspective. Maybe it's a setup. It's a setup for what's coming. It's a setup. It's not a detour. It's a setup. God is preparing the way. It's not a detour. It's a setup. It's a setup for what God has next. It's a setup for what he's about to bring, no matter how long it takes. I mean, for me, I'm looking at this, and Paul spent 7 verses setting up his argument for what's coming in verse 8. I'm thinking that's a lot of verses you're going to throw in there to set up what's about to come. But God never, he sets us up for as much setup as we need. And a lot of times we don't know how much setup we need to get to where we need to be for him to prepare us for what's coming. When God spoke to Abraham in the Jewish scriptures, you know how much setup Abraham needed for God's promise to be fulfilled? 25 years. And he was Father Abraham, many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. So let's just praise the Lord. That's a VBS song if you're not there. This is a man who believed God, and it was declared him as righteous, the father of the faith. And God had to prepare him for 25 years to get to where he needed to be to receive the fulfilled promise. So 7 verses doesn't seem like very much in that context. How much setup do you need for what God is preparing you for? How much setup do you need for what he's about to give you? Maybe it's not a detour. Maybe it's not a distraction. Maybe it's preparation for what you're about to face. So look at verse 8. What has he been preparing us for? Right here. Owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. It's a quote from Leviticus chapter 19. It's a popular quote. Paul used it in other scriptures. Jesus used this quote: love your neighbor as yourself. But owe no one anything except love. And then he gives those illustrations there, those commandments. Don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't steal, don't covet, and any other commandment summed up with that one phrase: love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus was asked the question, and he was asked, what is the greatest commandment in all of the Old Testament? One of the religious leaders was trying to trap him in this theological debate. What's the greatest commandment? And Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And he said, he goes beyond the question. The guy who asked the question just wanted to know the greatest. Jesus gave him the greatest commandment, and then he gives him a follow-up, and he says, the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And on those two statements, the entire law and prophets hang. That's all of the Jewish scriptures. That's all of the Old Testament. Love God, love people. Love God, love people. And if you do that, you're fulfilling God's calling on you, if you really think about it. But the problem becomes is we take the word love and use it in all kinds of contexts, right? I love tacos. I love my kids. I love pizza. I love my wife. Now, does that elevate pizza or belittle my wife? Both, right? And that's just our language. I'm not saying stop using love in that way. Maybe you should. Maybe you should. But Paul, the way he's talking about love is it's a bigger deal than the way we even use it in our modern context. Because love is not an emotion we feel about something. You know, we feel a fondness for a food, pizza, tacos, ice cream. We feel a fondness, so we love it. We feel a fondness for a certain, shoes or a certain outfit. I love that. We feel a fondness for another human being. I love them. I feel love for them. But the thing is, love isn't a feeling. That's a fondness. That's an attraction. That is, a likeness. Love is a decision. It's an action. You decide to love somebody. You make the conscious decision to love. And because it's a decision, you can also make the conscious decision not to love them in how we respond to them and how we act around them. And so when Paul writes, quoting from Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself. And in doing that, verse 8, owe no one anything except to love each other. Oh, only love, only owe love. For the believer, there's only one debt that is owed to everyone and never expires, and it's always outstanding. That's love. Love. Love is really, it's the defining characteristic of the believer because it's an ongoing, active decision that we consistently have to make. And that's, Peter writes that in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8. He says, maintain constant love for one another. Maintain constant love. Maintain it. That means keep it up. Don't stop. Don't quit it. Keep it up. I mean, you have to give it attention. It can't be just a default setting in your brain. Well, I'm close to this person. I'm married to this person. I'm related to this person, so I have to love them. A default. No, he says maintain constant love for one another, each other, everyone. So you have to keep it up. You have to work on it. Maintain it. Don't let it be neglected. Maintain it and let it be constant. Not ebbing and flowing with your emotion, not how you feel about the person in the moment, and not even in response to how they act around you. Not even in response to what they say about you or to you in the midst of an argument. Maintain constant, consistent, never failing love for one another. Maintain it. But the only way we can do that, the only way really we can do that is to know what real love is, what true love is. And the presence of God's love is the only way that we can know and express real love. Without knowing God's love, all that we are doing is imitating what is real, imitating the fake, giving an imitation of what the world tells us love is. We can only express real love to each other, decide to love each other, if we have known what real love is by access to Jesus. Receiving God's love is the only opportunity to give true love. Receiving God's love is the only opportunity to give true love. You must have inflow to have any kind of outflow. You must have God's love flowing into you in order to have any kind of love flowing out of you. It must come in to go out. And He sends it to us in great waves, in great impact, in great purpose. But again, I don't know about you, a lot of times the love that I receive from God, I allow to just come in me and stay. Stay. Let it, sit there. Instead of being a through street, I'm a dead end. I'm a cul-de-sac. It's not leaving, it's just coming. It's like a clogged artery. It's just coming and not going anywhere. I've got to clean it out in order to allow His love to flow through me into other people in how I respond to other people and how I speak to other people and how I, as he would say, love other people. Look at verse 10. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is fulfilling the law. Love does no wrong. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Zero wrongs. That's not just wrong on purpose. That's not just a wrong by commission. You're committing a wrong against somebody. That's also, love does no wrong by omission, by neglecting to do something, by seeing a problem with someone and then stepping over it and ignoring it. I tell my kids all the time when they come and complain about a mess somebody made that if you see the problem, if you see the mess, and you step over it and don't do anything about it, you're just as guilty as the one who made it if you don't help fix it. You're just as guilty as the one who left it there if you don't do anything about it. But how often do we do that too, right? If you see an empty toilet paper roll, do you just leave it for the person who emptied it? If you see a full trash can, do you try to shove it down so it fits your stuff and the next person's got to get it? I'm guilty of that one. Just being honest. I remember an old sitcom. A husband and wife got home from a vacation and there was a suitcase left on the stairs. He thought she needed to take it. She thought he needed to take it, and the suitcase sat there for weeks. Weeks. His mother-in-law, or her mother-in-law, his mom tried to put it up. He said, no, she needs to put that up. He ended up putting a dead fish in it, thinking that would make her put it up because it's her fault. It's both their fault because they both stepped over the thing. He says, love does no wrong. Zero whatsoever. Remember, if we're maintaining constant love, we're keeping it up, we're doing it on purpose. And so we're going out of our way to help somebody else. And so he says, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. The question then would arise, who is my neighbor? Well, then who is my neighbor so that I can put a parentheses around these people, and everyone outside of that circle I can do wrongs to. It's okay. I can neglect them because they're not, within my circle of influence. Who is my neighbor? That question actually was asked of Jesus in Luke chapter 10. Guy comes to Jesus, Jesus having quoted this, love your neighbor as yourself, and says, okay, Jesus, fine. Who is my neighbor? And then Jesus gives a parable about a guy who is going from one city to the next, and he gets beat up nearly to death. He's almost dead, nearly dead, not quite all dead, but he's almost there. And he gets robbed, everything gets stolen. And a priest comes by, sees the guy, walks by on the other side of the road. A Levite, a temple worker, comes by, walks by on the other side of the road. And then a Samaritan comes by, a guy who has great cultural, racial hatred for the man who's been beat up. And he knows that the man who's been beat up has great cultural, racial hatred for him. This guy stops, takes care of the man, gets him to somebody who can take more care of him, pays a small fortune for this other guy to take care of the man. And Jesus, having told the parable, then asks the crowd, okay, then who acted like the neighbor? They said, well, obviously the guy who had mercy on him. And so the question, probably the way Jesus told the parable, should not be, who is my neighbor? But should be, to whom can I be a neighbor? It flips it. It's not about who can I, who do I have to be nice to? It's how can I act? How can I act? To whom can I be a neighbor? And the obvious answer, both to Paul and to Jesus, is anybody and everybody. Anybody, are they breathing? Do they have a heartbeat? Then that qualifies. That is who Paul is talking about. That is who Jesus is talking about. We need to do love. Do love. Don't be love. Only God can be love. God is love. But we need to do love. We need to do it. We need to act like it. Act like we have the love of Jesus in us. Act like we have it. Act like he's given it to us. And then we can go and live it out. But you say, okay, that's a neat thing to say. Live it out. Live out the love that we have. Cool, I like it. But give me something practical here. Right? How can we do that? Do love. Maintain constant love in my life, even to the people I don't like, the people that are mean to me, the people that don't act very kindly to me. How can I do this? Well, Paul gives us a description in another one of his letters of what love is. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, starting in verse 2. This is what love is. Paul writes, "If I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so that I can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing." Now look at what he's saying. If I have the gift of prophecy, if God has allowed me to see what's coming, see the future, all right, let's put it in modern vernacular. If I can see it, what's coming. If I understand all mysteries, if I have all wisdom and all knowledge, and if I have faith so that I can move mountains. He says, if I have all of this stuff, if I can see the future, and I am the wisest person in the world, and I'm the smartest person in the world, and I am the most faith-filled person in the world, and I can move mountains, but I don't have love, none of that means anything. None of it. No matter, everybody thinks I'm wise, everybody thinks I'm smart, everybody thinks I'm cool because I know the future, everybody thinks I'm so faith-filled because I can do this, but if I don't demonstrate love always to everyone, I am nothing. None of it makes any difference whatsoever. Verse 3. If I give away all of my possessions and I give over my body in order to boast but do not have love, I gain nothing. So he says, if I give away everything to the poor, if I sell everything I have, give all that money, if I give it to the poor, and then I sacrifice my very life for somebody else, but I don't have love, I'm nothing. Nothing. That doesn't even mean anything if there's no love in me. He says, and this is what love is. Verse 4. Love is patient. Love is kind. Now, we're going to read some of these, and I know some of you heard these probably at every wedding you've ever been to, right? He says love is patient. Love is kind. He doesn't say love is patient most of the time. Love is kind to most people, but there's some that are exceptions, obviously. That's not what's there, right? The idea behind the way he's phrasing this is love is always patient. Love is always kind. So if you are acting impatient towards someone, you are choosing impatience over love. You're choosing to be unkind to the person instead of choosing to love the person. This is incredibly, when God showed me this, incredibly convicting for me. Maybe not you. Maybe you're cool with this. But when I choose to be impatient with somebody, I'm choosing my feeling in the moment over choosing to love them. You say, man, that's a high standard. Yeah, it is. I'm not going to meet it. I'm imperfect. But that doesn't mean I should give up, right? Doesn't mean you should quit. Say, well, I'm never going to get there. Well, if you know Jesus, then you're going to be moving in the right direction. You're going to be moving in the right direction, moving towards this, pursuing this, working on this. Just like he said, maintain constant love for one another. It is a process. You are maintaining it. You're working on it. You're building up your strength to get there. So he says, love is patient. Love is kind. It's kind to everyone. Love does not envy. It's not envious towards another. It's not boastful. It doesn't brag to somebody else. If you love somebody, then you are not arrogant, prideful. Verse 5, love is not rude to someone. Love is not self-seeking. Now here's one. Love is not irritable. You ever been maybe a lot of you were irritable to somebody who you drove to church with this morning. Love is not irritable. I've been irritable. I was irritable yesterday. And so I chose my irritation over the love. Love is not irritable. We need to work on that. Now here's one that, man, sometimes you wish Paul didn't put stuff in there, right? Love does not keep record of wrongs. Love does not keep a record of wrongs. Don't elbow the person next to you. Love does not keep a record of wrongs. Sometimes when you're in the midst of a discussion and you bring up something from the past that was supposed to be forgiven, and you bring it up, you're choosing in that moment not to love the person you're talking to. Love doesn't keep that record. Doesn't keep it. Wiped out. Jesus loves us. He doesn't keep a record. So when the enemy brings it up to our mind, it's not Jesus shaming us. That's the enemy bringing shame. There's no record of wrongs in love. Love does not keep a record of wrongs. Verse 6. Love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but it rejoices in the truth. And here's the heart of it, verse 7. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Now, that's not just a run that he's throwing in there at the end of this section. Love bears all things. No matter what comes your way in the relationship you have with somebody and you love them, you can make it through anything because of the love. The love that Jesus has put in you, you can offer out. And nothing that comes can squash it because the love of Jesus is that powerful. It bears all things. It believes all things. But love always assumes the best. A lot of times, we are wired to assume the worst about somebody else's motivations. Maybe they've got a track record and a pattern that have earned that reputation, honestly. But love assumes the best. Love believes all things. And so sometimes in the moment, we may have to choose love when everything in our brain is telling us the opposite. It's telling us the opposite. But Jesus, when he died for us, he knew every single sin we were going to commit, and he died anyway. And he died anyway. Knowing we were going to commit, knowing a lot of us, human beings, were going to reject him, he died anyway. He chose love. He chose love, and he puts that on us. To love, maintain constant love. Love bears all things, love believes all things, love hopes all things in any circumstance. It endures all things. It always perseveres. It always stands up. Love can never be undone if we are constantly choosing to love, choosing that love. And maybe today you have never known this kind of love before. Maybe you were raised in a house that was never defined by this type of love. Maybe you've never known the love of Jesus like this. Maybe the Jesus you were told about was a Jesus who was mad all of the time. But that's not the way Jesus looks at us and talks to us. Jesus loves us. Jesus loves us in how he responds to us and how he talks to us and how he pursues us. He loves us. I heard an illustration one time. This employee was getting these emails from his boss, and the emails sometimes were in all caps, and he always felt anxiety. He was about to get fired, and so he went to his boss and talked to him about it, and the boss said, no, the problem is you're just reading the emails wrong. I like you. If I didn't, I'd fire you. He says, you need to read the emails as though I'm always smiling when I send them. A lot of times when we hear things from God or we read things in Scripture from God, some of us feel like he's mad at us when he's sending it to us. But we need to change the way we think, that maybe, perhaps, God has sent us his word as a word of love with a smile on his face, saying, here it is, receive it. Receive it. Doesn't matter what your past is. Doesn't matter what you did. Doesn't matter how irritable you were yesterday, how mad you got in the car this morning, or that word you said as you were in the car before you walked into church. I love you. I love you, even though that stuff is coming. Even though that stuff has happened. I died for you, even though that happened. And I forgive it, even though you haven't even done some of it. And if you've never known that love, then you can know it today. Today. And I'm going to give you a chance in just a second. Or maybe, as I was convicted in preparation for this message, maybe you need to retool how you love people around you. How you love people, choosing to love them, maintaining constant love. You need to do love, not just feel it. Maybe you don't feel like it today. Do it anyway. Do love.